American systems are built upon slavery. The tactics used have now reformed themselves through laws that directly target African Americans. These laws have normalized the incarceration of black men specifically. The normalization of the incarceration of black men has caused black communities to be stripped of fathers, brothers, and important figures in their communities, leading to an increase of poverty and lack of guidance for youth, furthering the cycle of imprisonment for young black boys with no guidance. The Reconstruction era, the failure of Reconstruction. A justice system built on racial discrimination, private prisons, stereotyping, the war on drugs, black youth, and judicial racism, and the effects of incarceration, are all contributors that have led us to the injustice system we have today. The origins of mass imprisonment did not start with prisons themselves, yet instead slavery. Slavery was the beginning of the idea of racial inferiority, causing black Americans to be targeted upon receiving rights. This has led to a power imbalance in America, allowing the ideas of racial inferiority to shape current systems in America, specifically the American justice system. The control obtained through slavery has reformed itself through the correctional system, essentially playing a role in judicial racial discrimination. Slave owners intended to create a relationship that caused slaves to be dependent on them through restrictive codes. They typically restricted slaves from learning to read and write, while their behavior and movement were heavily restricted and surveillance. Similarly to slavery, the enhancement of education is not promoted in incarceration facilities. Over half of the population of imprisoned people do not complete education programs, often leaving prison without any additional skills. The lack of completion of education programs leads to recidivism, creating a cycle of reincarceration. Whippings, beatings, torture, and even murder were common responses to perceived disobedience, working too slowly, or challenging authority. This threat of violence was designed not only to punish individuals but also to terrorize other slaves into compliance, reinforcing the idea that resistance or escape would result in extreme suffering or even death. Violence, physical harm, and abuse is not only something seen in slavery yet prisons as well. Prisons commonly have high rates of assaults, stabbing, fights, murder, etc. These events result in possible trauma to other inmates who witness this. Not only is the violence inflicted from inmate to inmate, but in some cases correctional officers inflict harm onto prisoners, creating an even more hazardous environment. The looming threat of violence creates forced compliance and submission in prisons. The Reconstruction era and the end of the Reconstruction era go hand in hand. The Reconstruction was groundwork for African Americans to gain rights, education, and a chance in society, while the end of Reconstruction was the beginning of inequalities being embedded to society. Emancipation encouraged former enslaved African Americans for the future. Hoping to be recognized as citizens rather than property, looking forward to the nation rebuilding its system on principles of equality and justice. After the Civil War, the Reconstruction era represented a progressive effort to rebuild the Southern states and redefine American society after slavery and the mass racial inequality. The federal government sought to integrate as freedmen into political, social, and economic life. The Freedmen's Bureau provided assistance such as food, medical care, education, and help negotiating labor contracts. The Bureau also played a key role in establishing schools and supporting African American communities as they transitioned to freedom. Reconstruction was further shaped by 3 constitutional amendments that expanded civil rights. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery nationwide. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born or naturalized in the United States, and the 15th Amendment prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. Together, these amendments aimed to ensure that Black Americans would gain the rights of white Americans. Throughout this period, Black men voted, held public office, and helped shape state and national governments for the first time in U.S. history. Reconstruction attempted to replace a system based on unpaid enslaved labor with a wage labor economy. Freedmen began to receive paid employment, land ownership, and independence, while federal policies encouraged labor contracts and legal protections. Education and community building were essential to this progression. With schools supported by the Freedmen's Bureau and Northern missionary organizations offering African Americans opportunities for literacy, political awareness, and social mobility, Reconstruction seemed to be fixing the racist system. Despite its hopeful beginnings, Reconstruction ultimately failed to achieve lasting equality. Resistance from white Southerners, the rise of violent groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, and the implementation of black codes undermined African Americans' rights and freedoms. Northern commitment to Reconstruction weakened over time, and the federal government gradually withdrew troops from the South. The Compromise of 1877 effectively ended Reconstruction, allowing Southern states to impose segregation, voter suppression, and discriminatory laws that would persist for decades under Jim Crow. In 1868, ratification of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution technically granted equal protections to African Americans, abolishing black codes. Jim Crow laws and state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation swiftly took their place. Black codes and Jim Crow laws reveal how the legal system has been used to suppress marginalized communities. Jim Crow laws, in particular, laid the foundation for many racially discriminatory policies. Although many of these laws have been abolished, some such as voter disenfranchisement have evolved into more subtle forms in our current society. The police are meant to protect, prevent, and serve their community. However, this has not always been the reality and, even today, it often falls short. Before what's most notably known as the first officially publicly funded, organized police force with officers on duty full-time was created in Boston in 1838, there was a form of police referred to as slave catchers often written out of America's history. Between North and South Carolina in the 1700s, approximately 730,000 enslaved people were held. The slave patrols carried one purpose: to create a system of terror and suppress slave uprisings. Their purpose was to pursue, apprehend, and return any runaway slaves to their owners, often using methods of excessive force to control and produce desired slave behavior. I do swear that I will, as searcher for guns, swords, and other weapons among the slaves in my district, faithfully, and as privately as I can, discharge the trust reposed in me as the law directs, to the best of my power. So help me, God. This oath displays the beginning biases of the policing system. The direct targeting towards African Americans alone displays how racial inequalities were built into the justice system, resulting in the disparities the black community faces today. North Carolina Slave Patrol continued until the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment. Throughout Reconstruction, groups similar to the KKK replaced slave patrols. The groups were often empowered to control and deny access to equal rights to freed slaves. They systematically enforced strict local and state laws such as black codes, among others, that regulated and restricted access to labor, wages, voting rights, and general freedoms for formerly enslaved people. The city of New Orleans opened its first police jail, essentially a slave prison for runaway slaves and slaves that resisted their enslavement. The prisoners were treated terribly, often whipped daily and shackled in chain gangs to labor on public works projects around the city for days and or months at a time. Once the 1820s came, free African Americans that worked as sailors and other transient jobs were deemed to be dangerous, the worst evil that threatens the peace of the South. This was due to the threat they posed to the institution of slavery and the racial status quo. The sailors represented freedom and equality that many white Americans feared would cause rebellions. Freedom was precarious for free black travelers who attempted to enter Louisiana. At any moment they could be stripped of all their legal rights, seized, and condemned to indefinite imprisonment. Slave prisons in New Orleans incarcerated 500 free black sailors each year, allowing the policing system to grow greater each year. As the city grew, the police jail system expanded, turning New Orleans into a police state, with one of the highest arrest and incarceration rates in the nation. Over time, the slave jails expanded to include free African Americans as well as poor whites, merging with workhouses and becoming essential tools for social and labor control. As slavery began to come to an end, the South replaced slavery as a mechanism to exploit black labor and restrict black freedom, leading to the widespread criminalization of African Americans. Authorities used policing, imprisonment, and especially vagrancy laws to discipline black resistance, exploit labor, and maintain racial and economic order before and after the Civil War. While emphasizing continuity between slavery and mass incarceration, particularly as these institutions evolved into the Jim Crow era. The criminal justice system is heavily impacted by the bias of police mentality and outdated judicial precedents. The system is largely driven by racial disparities, and the black community continues to be a target. All cruelty begins with dehumanization, not seeing the face of the other, not seeing the whole humanity of the other. A cultural regime of dehumanization has been constructed in many police departments. In that fertile ground, racial biases can spread and become entrenched. Private prisons have further promoted predatory incarceration for black men in the criminal justice system. These facilities are operated by private companies under government contracts, often with the goal of reducing costs and increasing efficiency, yet the benefits are often overstated or unclear. Privatization is viewed as a reduction of government spending, yet the cost savings are minimal or inconsistent. Private prisons house a small portion of incarcerated people but still play a significant role in immigration detention and certain state systems. When placed within a system already shaped by racial disparities, the expansion of privatized incarceration is a profit-motivated system that further reinforces the disproportionate targeting of black communities. Private prisons often do not significantly lower costs compared to public facilities, particularly when the quality of conditions are considered. Any financial savings may come from cutting staffing or essential services, which can lead to worse conditions for incarcerated individuals. In a system already reiterating racial bias, cutting cost raises concerns on the prisons it will affect. Lack of guards, creating a physical safety issue, lack of mental health care and educational programs for the prisoners' improvement, due to the lack of support needed from the staff. Companies that operate these facilities have been linked to lobbying efforts that support stricter sentencing laws, policies that can contribute to higher incarceration rates of marginalized communities. The financial gain can depend on the continued expansion of incarceration, disproportionately affecting black communities that are already over-policed and overrepresented in prisons. The presence of private prisons does not just reflect existing problems, it risks deepening them even further, reinforcing a system that continues to disadvantage black communities while prioritizing profit over justice. Types have played a prominent role in shaping the mass incarceration of black men in the United States. African American males in particular have an ethnic stereotype in which they are portrayed as dangerous criminals. The dangerous stereotypes placed upon black men have been reinforced through media, cycles created by the justice system, political rhetoric, and historical practices rooted in racism. These stereotypes influence public perception, contributing to aggressive policing strategies, racial profiling, and harsher sentencing. When black men are viewed through a lens of suspicion, their daily actions are more likely to be criminalized, increasing the likelihood of arrest and incarceration for behaviors that might be overlooked or treated more leniently in other groups. Criminality, further entrenching the very stereotypes that helped produce those rates in the first place. The war on drugs created a major shift in U.S. criminal justice policy by prioritizing punishment over public health. Although drug use existed across racial groups, enforcement strategies disproportionately targeted black communities. Intensifying the practice of racial profiling, police disproportionately stopping black men to be searched and arrested. Policies such as mandatory minimum sentencing, three-strikes laws, and aggressive policing tactics were implemented during a period of rising racial tension and political messaging that framed drug use as a criminal threat rather than a social issue. These policies were justified as crime control measures, but they ignored structural inequalities and instead intensified surveillance in predominantly black neighborhoods. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or blacks, But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night in the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did, Ehrlichman said. Propaganda was used in order to frame a criminal narrative onto black men, then created racially targeted policies to find truth within the racist rhetoric. One of the most significant contributors to mass incarceration was the disparity in sentencing for different drugs, particularly the harsher penalties for crack cocaine compared to powder cocaine. Crack cocaine, more prevalent in low-income black communities, carried sentences up to 100 times more severe than powder cocaine, which was more commonly associated with white people. Black men, despite being less than 13% of regular drug users, made up for 35% of drug arrests, 55% of convictions, and 74% of people sent to prison for drug possession crimes. Nationwide, black men were sent to state prisons for drug offenses 13 times more often than white men. The sentencing imbalance created by the difference in penalties led to a dramatic increase in the incarceration of black men for nonviolent drug offenses, despite similar rates of drug use across racial groups. As a result, black men became overrepresented in prisons and jails, reinforcing racial disparities within the criminal justice system. The long-term consequences of the war on drugs extend beyond incarceration, deeply affecting black families and communities. Imprisonment disrupts family structures, reduces access to employment, housing, and education, and perpetuates cycles of poverty and criminalization. Children growing up with incarcerated parents are more likely to experience emotional trauma and economic instability, increasing their likelihood of future involvement with the criminal justice system. The social changes caused by the war on drugs still affect how black men are treated today, especially through stereotypes that link them to crime. These ideas have influenced policing, leading to continued racial profiling and heavier surveillance in black communities. As a result, black men are more likely to be stopped, arrested, and jailed than white men, even for similar behavior. The war on drugs has not only fueled mass incarceration but has also sustained systemic racial inequality, making it a central factor in the continued over-incarceration of black men in America. Black men face racial profiling, sentencing disparities, police brutality, and many more racial inequalities in the legal system. Black men often fall victim to such inequalities due to the scary criminal black man stereotype. The disparities experienced by black men within the legal system often take root during childhood and adolescence. Rather than being treated as children in need of guidance and support, black youth are frequently criminalized for behaviors that are often overlooked or handled more leniently when exhibited by their white peers. Black youth is where the disparities often began, ranging from growing up in poverty causing them to commit illegal acts due to lack of education, lack of guidance, or simply being targeted due to their skin color. Black youth are 5.6 times as likely to be incarcerated than white youth. These racial disparities of incarceration grew more than 10% in 23 states. Black youth are already disproportionately impacted by policies and practices that funnel them into the youth justice system, often not receiving as much lenience as their white peers would receive. Police profiling and racial discrimination frequently end dangerously for many black men. Police encounters ending in violent confrontation causes injury or death. Policing has historically been shaped by inequality, misuse of power, and a lack of accountability, resulting in distrust and harm rather than safety. While there are officers who genuinely strive to uphold these ideals, systemic issues continue to undermine the purpose of policing, leaving the promise of protection and service unrealized for many. Encounters with the justice system have long-term consequences, essentially with the Three Strikes laws. Three Strikes laws mandates life sentences for individuals convicted of a felony who have one or two prior serious or violent convictions, often regardless of the severity of the most recent offense or the individual's potential for rehabilitation. Because black individuals are disproportionately policed, charged, and convicted from a young age, they are significantly more likely to accumulate the prior convictions that trigger these laws. As a result, three strikes policies highlight racial inequalities by turning youth criminalization into a permanent punishment. These laws create a prioritization of incarceration over rehabilitation, ensuring that systemic bias against black youth follows black men throughout their lives and contributes to the ongoing crisis of mass incarceration. Even upon release, formerly incarcerated people face barriers such as employment discrimination, housing restrictions, and loss of voting rights, which causes an increase in the likelihood of recidivism. These obstacles reinforce negative stereotypes that portray black men as inherently criminal, further justifying aggressive policing and racially targeted laws. As many black men become incarcerated, they leave behind their families, essentially leaving many other their children and wives to fend for themselves. Without the guidance of a father, this causes the child to be further at risk for substance abuse, depression, anxiety, and externalizing behaviors and disorders. The further they are at risk for these factors, increases their likelihood of having unresolved trauma throughout their adulthood, while also possibly leading them into a path of crime themselves due to the lack of resources and guidance. The creation of a single-parent household also creates a single-income home, which often can cause less opportunities for the children, such as higher or better education, not having extracurricular activities. Trauma and family disruption are deeply intertwined with the mass incarceration of black men, creating long-lasting effects upon not only their life but their families as well.
What led me to it was me feeling like I had to survive on my own or provide for myself or my family. So I just took the easiest route, something that I thought was the easiest thing. Because of my age, it was pretty hard for me to get a job, but that wasn't no excuse because I still started working at an early age. It wasn't enough to satisfy what I needed to get done. I had a child at a young age, so I had a lot more responsibilities on my plate than the average teenager. So I started working around, I would say 11, 12 years old. I just felt like I needed more at that time, which if I really would have buckled down and looked, or probably would have got a work permit, I most likely could have got another job, but I wasn't thinking at the time. I didn't have the right role models in my life or the proper people in my ear telling me to go the right way. It affected me a lot. Because my mental health, it really affected me when I did 2 years on lockup. That really affected my mental health. But a lockup is where they put you in like segregation. So it's 23 hours in a cell and you only come out 1 hour to shower and use the phone. Then you have to go back in your cell for the rest of the day. So I spent 2 years like that, isolated in a cell by myself, because they took me to a lockdown program, a disciplinary program, for something that happened in prison. So it definitely affected my mental health, me going through that situation. And like I said, me just being locked up, period, it affected my mental health. Relationship with my child's mother, my child, my mother, my sister, my family, my whole family, it affected, because I was missing time out of their lives for my selfish actions or for what I thought was right at the time. I feel like I wasn't treated fairly, but who am I to tell them that I'm not being treated fairly, you know? You gotta play by their laws, their rules. I mean, so I don't think I was treated fairly, no, because that was my first conviction, my first really offense, and they sent me to federal prison for 7 years. That was the first time I ever did prison time. Like, I had been arrested before, but I never done prison time, and that was the first time that they sent me to prison, that I caught my actual conviction, my charge. And I felt like that wasn't right, that wasn't fair. But like I said, who am I to say that wasn't fair? It's a big difference. Everything is segregated in the federal system. So all the blacks stay with the blacks, all the whites stay with the whites. and all the Mexicans, they're all in one group. And it's just definitely different treatment within the COs, the wardens, the staff in the prison. Some prisons are harsher than others. Some correctional officers are more meaner than others to certain races. And yeah, like the whole 2 years I was on segregation lockup, I experienced multiple things with officers that done things to me that wasn't right. And it's a mind-blowing experience when you actually going through a situation like that. Like, and you're putting paperwork down, you're trying to report it to the right type of people, it's not getting addressed properly, your grievances are being thrown away. Grievances is just like a write-up, so you can write an officer up and try to send it to a warden or a supervisor higher than that officer, but the officer has to deliver the paperwork to the box, and they might look at it and rip it up. They might not put the grievance in the box, so your case might not never get answered. That triggered me, yes, going to prison, because I looked at things for the perception of what it was like. I seen the fancy cars, the clothes, the jewelry, and I thought those things were cool. I thought it was right to go out and hustle to get the things that you want. And no, you go out and work for the things that you want. You work hard, you save your money, anything of that nature, drug programs, anything that you need help with, they will try to assist you with it, like, if you want help. So it's there if you want the help. You just got to utilize the different program and use it to your best abilities while you got that downtime. Yeah, I seen a difference. Yeah, I seen a big difference, because I mean, people might wind up back in prison, or like they can't come home early, or can't get the year off of their sentence, or it definitely affects them, like even down to the learning skills and the behavioral tactics, like constant indolence and blaming people for your actions and just different things of that nature. The program teach you different stuff, how to deal with different stuff, and how to approach certain situations. So it's definitely a program that you can utilize, a good program.
Person was the father of my child, who was very young at the time of his incarceration. His incarceration affected our family emotionally. Our child was only 5 when he went away, so she missed a large part of her father's presence during her childhood. There was sadness, confusion, disappointment, and emotional strain. As a parent, it was difficult to watch a child navigate milestones, questions, and emotions without having her father physically present. The incarceration created both financial and personal challenges. Although his family helped where they could, I had to pick up much of the slack and make sacrifices to ensure our child was cared for and had what she needed. I had to carry more responsibilities alone, manage parenting decisions independently, and work hard to provide stability and normalcy despite difficult circumstances. Yes, it affected me mentally. There was a lot of stress, pressure, and emotional exhaustion that came along with raising the child largely on my own during that time. I worried about my child's emotional well-being, our future, and the long-term effect the experience might have on her. The experience definitely changed the relationship. Years of separation, missed milestones, and parenting from a distance created challenges. There were moments of frustration because so much of responsibilities fell on me alone. But there was also an understanding that incarceration impacted everyone involved, especially the child. Yes, missing 7 to 8 years of your child's life leaves lasting effects. Important childhood moments, routines, and experiences cannot be recreated. The experience affected family dynamics, relationship, and emotional development, and some of those impacts continue even now. I believe race can play a role within the criminal justice system, as it is difficult not to consider whether race influences how people are treated, judged, or sentenced. The hardest part was watching our child grow up without her father being present for so many important moments, carrying the emotional, financial, and parenting responsibilities largely on my own while trying to protect and support my child was incredibly challenging. I wish people understood that incarceration affects entire families, not just the person serving the sentence. Children lose time, parents make sacrifices, and families often have to rebuild stability while dealing with emotional and financial strain. I would want a system that better considers the impact incarceration has on the family and children while placing more focus on rehabilitation, accountability, and maintaining healthy family connections whenever possible.